Hello, I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm providing some brief lectures and commentaries on topics for the courses I teach in literary and cultural studies. In this installment, I'm going to say some things about the metaphor of base and superstructure in Marxist theory. This concept was developed very early on by Marx and Engels as they reacted to the idealism of the young Hegelians. As Marx and Engels famously asserted, they stood Hegel on his head, rejecting Hegel's theorization of historical process and the dialectic as something that happens in the realm of ideas, and asserting instead that material production is the driving force of history. The metaphor of base and superstructure is used by Marx and Engels in their argument that the economic forces of production and the economic relations of production, that is, the material base, determines the forms of social consciousness in a society and the structure of the ruling order. This is one of the most important components of Marxist theory for literary and cultural studies, especially as it relates to the theory of ideology and the role of art in the production of ideology. Following early 20th century Marxist theorists like Karl Kautsky and George Plekhanov, traditional Marxist theorists interpreted base to mean specifically material reality and superstructure to mean something like social and intellectual phenomena. And many interpreted Marx's argument to mean that there is a straightforward relationship of mechanical causality between the base and the superstructure. According to this assumption, a feudal economic order will inevitably produce the particular forms of government, art, religion, law, and so on, characteristic of the European Middle Ages, while a capitalist order will produce those forms of bourgeois modernity. But this straightforwardly mechanistic understanding of the relationship between base and superstructure is seen as too simplistic by most contemporary Marxist theorists, and Marx and Engels themselves provide several more complex statements on the problem as well. An early articulation of the concept of base and superstructure is found in Marx and Engels' critique of the idealism of the young Hegelians in The German Ideology, written in the mid-1840s. They write, "Civil society embraces the whole material intercourse of individuals within a definite stage of the development of productive forces. It embraces the whole commercial and industrial life of a given stage, and, insofar, transcends the state and the nation, though, on the other hand again, it must assert itself in its foreign relations as nationality, and inwardly must organize itself as state." They go on to say, "The word civil society emerged in the 18th century when property relations had already extricated themselves from the ancient and medieval communal society. Civil society as such only develops with the bourgeoisie. The social organization evolving directly out of production and commerce. Which in all ages forms the basis of the state and of the rest of the idealistic superstructure." Significantly, Marx and Engels are historicizing the concept of civil society in this passage, as opposed to idealist philosophers of the time who would take civil society as a trans-historical given. For Marx and Engels, civil society is a product of modernity, of capitalist relations of production, and part of the superstructure. One of the most frequently cited passages on the base superstructure metaphor comes from Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy, written in 1859, 15 years after the German Ideology. There, Marx begins by noting that he developed the concept through a critical re-examination of Hegel's writings on the philosophy of law. Marx notes that Hegel, like the English and French thinkers of the 18th century, saw civil society in terms of legal and political discourses. But Marx will argue that the anatomy of civil society has to be sought in the economy. The relevant passage is one that I've also discussed in another webcast on the concept of historical materialism. It begins, "In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely, relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society, the real foundations on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." Then Marx continues with another familiar passage in which he argues that debates about the structure of society are only the epiphenomenal forms of a conflict over contradictions in the material base, the economic foundations of society. And Marx concludes, "Just as one does not judge an individual by what he thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness. But on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production. No social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace the older ones before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society." As I mentioned earlier, the relationship of base and superstructure and the question of ideology are very important for the study of literature and culture. Marx doesn't discuss the production of literature in detail, but in a famous passage from the Grundrisse, he briefly considers the question of why classical Greek art remains popular in modern society. If the mechanical causality model of relationship between base and superstructure holds true, it would seem that the epic poems of Homer or the great tragedies of Sophocles would have no appeal for readers in a modern bourgeois society. And yet we know these works retain their power to move and engage modern audiences. Marx doesn't come up with a satisfactory answer to this puzzle, but modern structuralist and post-structuralist theorists have done so. It's merely that a play by Sophocles isn't, in fact, the same play in terms of its conditions of production and reproduction in the 20th or 21st century that it was in ancient Greece. The play has been wrenched from its original historical context and divorced from its original social function and made to play a new role in the context of a modern set of social, political, and economic relations. I'll return to this problem in another webcast discussing Althusser's theory of ideology. As always, if you have questions or comments as you're reading about and thinking about these issues, don't hesitate to send me an email.